Good day, and welcome to another episode of the Vigilante Dialogues. I am your host, Shaina Smith-Archer, welcoming you to the National Boardroom. If this is your first time viewing or hearing the program, Vigilante is the Virgin Islands national motto, which means to be watchful. Our mission is to have a dialogue and a conversation about the issues affecting our quality of life and how we solve them. The Dialogues is broadcast live here on Facebook Live as well as our YouTube channel on first and third Thursdays at 7:30 p.m. and replayed on CBN FM90.9. So last time I was here, or no, time before last, I had a few colleagues that I had co-opted. So tonight is going to be my BVI Umoja Dialogues Buzz, meaning now that I have, it's a multi platform show. So I have with me again my friends, Eduenka from Umoja, Bishop Klein from my BVI, Gary Reimer from BVI Buzz, and I also co-opted our legal mind, Daniel Davies, to be here tonight to help us with unpacking the COI report. So the last time we were here, it was before the report was actually issued. So now that we've had it for a couple weeks, it's time for us to start to get into the meat of the matter. So I'll pause here, just everybody say good night to our audience, and then we get going. So starting with you, Daniel, go ahead.
Good night, everyone. My name is Daniel Flicklestone Davies. I'm a lawyer at Silk Legal, actually its managing partner, and also the son of a bookshop owner from Serendipity Books. I can't say much more. I was the lawyer for the elected officials that were not ministers in the Commission of Inquiry.
Okay. Gary?
Gary Reimer, BVI lender, currently live in Atlanta, so currently in the BVI diaspora, and always interested in the insights of the BVI, even though I'm not living back home, but I'm always keeping my eye out, interested in news stories and keeping abreast of what's going on back home. So happy to be here.
All right, thanks for coming back. Mr. Eduenka from Umoja.
Yes, peace and blessings, everyone. I'm Eduenka, as you've heard, with top program Umoja. And Umoja is a program that strives to promote unity in our family, our country, our community, and our race. And we bring information, useful information that we are able to make informed decisions. So, peace and blessings, and I'm glad to be here, Shana, all of you, my colleagues. Peace and blessings to all of you.
And thank you for coming back. And the last but not least, Bishop Klein. We're just saying
John Klein, pastor of the New Life Baptist Church. I wear many hats as a businessman, political advocate, social activist, and political activist, and I would like to consider myself one of the gatekeepers of the Virgin Islands, and happy to join the dialogue tonight.
All right, thank you. All right, guys, so everybody has had a chance to flip through this 1,000+ page report by now, I hope. It's very daunting, but I realize, it's very descriptive in that it needs a précis version or some Cliff Notes version. Somebody actually suggested to me, for persons that may have reading disabilities, but they want to read it maybe you should have had an audio version. So I don't know, we're putting that out there maybe for the powers that be to consider it, because it's a very important document, I think, to all of us as Virgin Islanders and residents here. And it's important that we all, have the opportunity to digest all the information that's out there. So just to start at the top, to kind of set the stage, I'm going to ask Daniel to, in 30 seconds, explain what's a commission of inquiry in terms of what it was, first of all. What is a commission of inquiry? Because for some people, this might have been the first they've ever heard about one. It's not the first one we've had here in the Virgin Islands. I already confirmed that with one of our historians. There was actually a commission of inquiry that was done after the Wikomsky development debacle into the Bates Hill contract. So that's something for another day. But Daniel, what is a COI? You're on mute.
A commission of inquiry is really, and what it is really dependent on what the terms of reference are, what the terms of references are, I should say. And in this instance, it was to investigate whether or not there's any information as to whether or not there's poor governance or corruption occurring in the BVI. It was formed underneath the Commission of Inquiry Act of, I believe it was 1888 or 1880. And the important thing about that legislation is that it's a colonial era law, but it has been updated subsequently. I think the latest amendment was in the 1970s, but nonetheless, it's a colonial era law. And what it really is, it's an investigation or inquiry, and it differs from the ordinary court processes, even though the commissioner has the power of a judge with respect to summoning evidence.
Okay. All right. So this was basically sort of a procedural investigation.
This was an investigation as to good governance in the territory. So what are the deficiencies in our governance models and our key programs, in other words, if any? And whether or not our public officials have been complying with their obligations in carrying out their mandates.
Okay. So when I looked at I guess it was the opening letter that the commissioner, so Gary Hickenbottom, wrote. In terms, he submitted the report to the governor. That's the other thing for persons to understand, that that's what happened. And then from there, the governor released it publicly a few weeks later. So the commission, he said that he was asked to conduct a full, faithful, and impartial inquiry into whether there was information that corruption, abuse of office, or other serious dishonesty in relation to officials, whether statutory or elected or public, may have taken place in recent years. Consider conditions that had allowed such conduct to happen, and if it still exists, and then make independent recommendations to improve the standards of governance and the operation of the agencies of law enforcement and justice. So at the start of the report, everybody knows that there were 4 primary recommendations, because again, when the governor confirmed that he had received the report and was making it public, he spoke to these. So we're going to start with those primary recommendations and then go further into the details, because as he said, the 45 recommendations are within the 4 primary recommendations that were made in terms of what he thinks should be happening now as a result of this. So the first one was temporary partial suspension of the Constitution. He made several comments in terms of why it was necessary because of the bad state of affairs, and that he had considered lesser measures, which I would be very curious to know what those were, and to also tap into the talent of Virgin Islanders and create an advisory council. So I'm going to kind of like open up the floor now. What were your thoughts, Gary, as it relates to that first recommendation?
The suspension of the Constitution you're referring to, right?
Yeah, the temporary partial suspension.
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the last session. So I think when you asked the question before, as far as our thoughts, as far as do we think there was anything there for partial suspension, I think most of us agreed that we thought there were not. I guess the issue right now, I think, for most people is being able to differentiate between the report and the issue of what happened the day before or before. So I think people need to understand that there are 2 separate issues. They're unrelated to each other, because the the COI could not do or did not have the power to do any criminal investigations. They didn't have the power for any of that. All of their recommendations were based on information that they had. It was not based on any, based on the report, no factual criminal intent based on the information provided in the COI. It was basically based on potential, based on different situations that you could have. And that's why I think right now that they're doing, the governor has called for these criminal investigations into the different acts. But as far as the actual partial suspension, I think we're to the point now where I think they're still weighing the options, but I think weighing it in the veins of what has transpired, meaning, okay, we no longer have the former premier, we have a new premier, we have a coalition government now. So I think their options are being weighed in that vein as opposed to before, or we're in a different stance.
Okay. So, Carmel, why do you think he made this recommendation? Because, you and I have been speaking about this at length since the report became public, in terms of, because for me, if it's an impartial inquiry, some assumptions had to be made in terms of coming to the conclusion that in order to fix the issues that were found, that partial suspension of the Constitution, which would affect basically the ministerial government, the elected government, and allow the governor to basically directly rule the country, would come about. What do you think, triggered that? Give us your thoughts.
All right, I missed some of your conversation, so you're gonna have to help me. Trigger what?
Okay, so we're talking about the primary recommendations first, and the first one we know was the temporary partial suspension of the Constitution. So Gary gave us his thoughts in terms of what that would mean for us, and whether it or not it basically is still hanging over our heads because we have not.
Excuse me. So you're asking why I think he recommended suspending the Constitution?
Yeah, because you and I have spoken at length about the report and how you feel about the report.
Well, I think the recommendation in the preamble, I think he gave his reasons, and he made a prediction that he's unable to make, that no one is able to make, that unless the Constitution is suspended and we have direct rule, the poor governance, the quote unquote poor governance, would continue indefinitely. I don't know if you all read that sentence in there, and that struck me as arrogant, because he has no real authority to predict that future. And so I think Mr. Hickenbottom made the assumption that we were incapable of implementing the recommendations or transforming our governance into a better governance. So that's why I think he made that recommendation. And to me, of course, that speaks of a premeditated intention. That the whole goal, the objective of the COI was to do just that, suspend the Constitution, because as Brother Gary Reimer just mentioned, a lot of the language in the COI is ambiguous, may have been corruption, or the possibility for corruption exists, and all that kind of language.
But so nothing definitive in that
right.
case.
So now they're starting to investigate, and a couple of things struck me about the COI is that the recommendations could have been brought forth decades ago,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that the governor, as the representative of the administering power, had the authority to make those recommendations and implement the recommendation as he's doing right now. I mean, that's proof that he has the authority, the fact that he's doing it right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was the responsibility of the administering power to make sure that the colony was advancing towards good self good self governance.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's sad to me
Uh-huh.
is how we here in the Virgin Islands allow the administering power to blame us for for quote unquote bad governance when it was their responsibility to make sure that good governance in the territory was advanced.
Yeah.
And so and it is this habit that European governments have in all their colonial processes, in all of their wars, and all of the ways in which they attempt to control the world, is that they create a condition and then victimize the person who's involved in the condition that they create, and then blame the victim for the situation that if he found himself in.
Okay, but before you go there, I'm gonna let you stick a pin. Because that's part of what I want to get into a little bit further down, right? But I want Daniel to paint a picture though also with this, because what's very important for us to highlight a part of this is how this seems to be out of the, I don't know if it's the FCO playbook, if there is one, because we have had other overseas territories that have had similar situations where suspension of their constitution. How does this compare, Daniel, to what happened in TCI, Montserrat? I think Cayman also had their constitution suspended at one point.
Well, while it would appear to be a part of their modus operandi, I prefer to look at what's happening in the BVI specifically, because our set of circumstances are significantly different than what occurred in both the TCI and in the Cayman Islands.
Okay.
What happened in TCI, I think there were actual findings of corruption happening, as opposed to in the BVI, where it was just suggested that there may be some information that exists that may or may not suggest that corruption was happening. And as opposed, what the major issue in the COI report was governance issues above everything else, as to whether this is good governance or bad governance, whether it's following a procedure that is open and transparent, and so on and so forth. What I would say, though, just as a Virgin Islander, is that the suspension of the Constitution was in no way something that was palatable to me, either whether it was a suspension in part or in full. Because at the end of the day, you do not accomplish good governance by breaking international law. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which is something that has been extended to the BVI and something that the United Kingdom naturally has signed on to, Article 25 reads that every citizen, or in this case belonger, shall have the right and the opportunity, without any of the distinctions mentioned in Article 2 and without unreasonable restrictions, to take part in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives. That is international law. So
So
you
what
don't.
does that mean to the average listener?
What that means is essentially it's almost as if the police are there to enforce the law by breaking the law themselves without any with no accountability whatsoever. Who would be there to hold this advisory council and the governor accountable on our behalf, for instance?
Okay, so
How
you're
would the
saying
people?
the accountability that we talk about all the time in terms of being part of good governance would not be there in a situation of temporary suspension of the Constitution.
Absolutely not. And one of the things that we also have to recognize is that our culture is fundamentally different than the culture that prevails in the United Kingdom. We are much more Americanized with how we view our rights and our democracy, and in that instance,
Hmm.
what the UK would wish to implement in their direct rule may not align itself with what we see as being a part of BVI culture, as it were,
Yeah,
our way of doing things.
yeah.
And a little example before I close on the point is that let's take a look at who we look to for guidance. Do we look to the Queen and what happens in the United Kingdom for guidance, generally speaking, as a people, or do we look to see what happens in the United States to see whether or not we should adopt that in particular?
Uh-huh.
And that will guide you as to where our cultural leaning lies. I'm not
Yeah,
saying that we are an American culture. It's just saying that i- our culture is just and a way of thinking is just fundamentally different.
yeah. In terms of how it is. Okay, so moving on to the next primary recommendation was a constitutional review. We all know that this was something that was discussed um, for many years now. We actually had a commission that was appointed at the end of last year, but as far as I know, no work has started on the ground as it relates to that. So, were there any surprises there in terms of that recommendation from anybody, or that we know that that's something that we need to get done? So, you know, we would agree with what's being proposed. What's your thoughts?
Can you say that again?
So the second primary recommendation was a constitutional review. So I'm asking that because that has been something that has been discussed for quite some time, is that a surprise to any of us, or that is something that we can all agree that needs to be done for various reasons?
Well, I think that we've been talking about that review for quite some time. But if I may, Shayna, before I get to that, there are a couple of things that Daniel mentioned that I would like to talk about,
Okay.
and and the whole position of international law in regards to our democracy, and for that reason in particular, I was thinking that as a government, we should have been preparing a presentation to the United Nations in that regard, as far as our democratic rights are concerned, and particularly because of the responsibilities under Article 73 or under the United Nations the Convention of 1514, made in 1960,
Mm-hmm.
that the administering power's responsibility was to advance our governance towards self governance.
Yeah.
And I observed this whole commission inquiry and the recommendations as a failing of the administering power's responsibility to the territory.
Mm-hmm.
And for them to now come suddenly after decades of neglect and decades of supposedly things that we've been doing wrong to now deprive us of our democratic process. Something must be wrong with that. Without knowing any law at all, common sense, I'll be happy if Daniel will be in on that point. The other point, the other thing that Daniel mentioned about culture, the whole recommendation about the grants, the grants that the politicians, the discretionary grants that the politicians have there they give to persons in need. I doubt very seriously if you could find any corruption in the administration or the distribution of those grants. Those grants are part of a culture where we help members of the community that is in immediate need. When the grants from social development would be too late to help to remedy the situation of the members of the community. And in many instances, the elected representatives give out those grants to people in need, whether it's to help pay their rent, or they have a kid in college that need to make up their tuition, or they need to buy food for their kids. A lot of times that grant money runs out and the politician take money out of his own pocket. The politician don't benefit from those small little that small amount of money. So
Cromwell, is $6 million plus was spent in 2020. That ain't no little bit of money.
That's a little bit of money for people who in need, and no one person wasn't spending. No one person wasn't spending that money, Shaina. It was
I'll let you finish. Go ahead.
and not only that, and there are processes by which you give out that money. There's farms that the politician follow to give out to give out that money. The politician don't write a check out of the treasury checkbook. There's a process by which the politician give out that grant. So all the paperwork is there. So I don't. What I'm saying is.
Okay, finish your point and then we'll talk on that, because then I'll just reverse the order on how we're gonna tackle these.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, one of the things that should happen is that the government should do an analysis of the COI report, and particularly the recommendations, to see if how they would impact our society and our culture and our people. Because some of those recommendations, look, the whole conflict of interest thing that they're talking about when you talk about registry of interest.
Yeah.
And they want to extend that whole registry of interest to all the civil servants.
Well, right? Senior civil servants.
But they force the politicians, then the senior civil servants, and then all the civil servants. It goes all the way down to them. And my concern is that the country is a small country. So what we really need is transparency when it comes to the procurement processes. Because if I have a company and the government is the major purchaser, the major employer, and I'm going to serve the country, and I have a company that needs to do some business with the government, you can't stop me from doing business with the government. You have to have a transparent procedure where the population can see that I win this procurement, this bid fair and square. I think that's what's needed. Not this harsh conflict of interest suggestion that is practiced in large metropolitan countries where you have huge markets for persons to do business in. So some of these things might not be applicable to us, or might harm, or some of these recommendations might be of harm to our community, into the way we do business culturally, and they're not necessarily corrupt practices. So we need to do an analysis of these things to see what in fact the consequences of these recommendations would be and the impact it would have on our culture in our community, to see whether we should in fact implement them or amend them or use some of them to strengthen our administrative processes and our good governance. We shouldn't just wholesale
No.
take into these recommendations that is put forward by the report.
Yeah, and I think that is what the premier has been saying, in all of his statements I've been hearing over the last 2 weeks. As far as it's not just for the recommendations as presented in the report to just be carried forward, because the recommendations are just that, they're recommendation. Exactly how these things are supposed to be implemented, the cost benefit analysis needs to be done, because everything, it might be presented in terms of this is the benefit of doing it this way, but it is always going to have a cost, whether it's human resources needed, money that's needed, a change of infrastructure, whatever it might be, that we have to make sure that these things go into place. So I think where I differ with you, and just to clarify something you said about the assistance grants. The assistance grants, the biggest problem that was identified, and which I know has been the case for years, is that the process that's there, it doesn't align with how we're supposed to be managing public monies. You have in the Financial Management Act where an accounting officer is supposed to have authority over money that is spent. So when it comes to specifically the House of Assembly member assistance grants and how that was used, the initial intent of it was for district offices and small district projects, right? And it went from 60,000 per district member, 25,000 for territorial, went up to 125 for district, to 150 for territorial, right? So it was supposed to be about $1.725 million. You had one point where the government had allocated $2.74 million towards assistance. And I agree with you that it does serve a purpose in terms of district reps being able to assist persons, but there was no criteria. There is no clear criteria in terms of a transparent process. Internal audit complained about not being able to find records, when they audited it back in 2009, 2011. So it is something that needs to be cleaned up, based on what evidence that's being reported there, plus on information that I know from before, right? How they come up now with the new assistance grant program is left to be seen, and that is what we have to now wait to hear from the Ministry of Health. Because to take all this money and just put it in there, understanding that this comes now with people attached to it, those persons are going to have to be vetted to see whether or not, again, they qualify for what was being granted. Because we got to be honest, there are some cases where persons might not qualify to continue to receive the assistance grant for one reason or another. And we'll have to figure out whether then is it that Social Security has to fill that gap, or something else has to be done to make sure that our people are getting the assistance that's needed in the cases like that. So there's social implications. But while we're on that, Gary, what's your thoughts on the assistance grants? Because they went through the members' benefits, the ministry benefits, the ministry grants, as well as what came forward in response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
So a lot was said a little while ago. I had a lot of different things I was thinking about. So let me touch a little bit. So let's talk a little bit.
Focus on the assistance grants for now. We'll get to the other stuff as far as the other recommendations.
So I kind of agree that we're kind of in a rock and a hard place because of culturally the way we're doing things. That's one thing. People are accustomed of the way we're doing things. That doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, but the custom of doing things and the custom from the minister. It also creates a way for the ministers now that the district representative now, it creates a barrier, an indirect barrier now, because with their program, they kind of had a direct impact or direct relationship with their constituents relating to this grant now. Now, you created a barrier now, so now that particular constituent now has to go to a government agency now for aid or grant, indirectly opposed to their district rep, who may living in their living in the district may already know what people's situations are and is aware of the situation. So now you have a situation now where you're being forced to create a process. And I think, as I said before, the last time I was here, a lot of things now, what's going to happen is we're going to pay a price because we're now acting reactively as opposed to proactively. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
these things that are in place that we're having to do now, we could have done it for ourselves. We could have created these things ourselves. Now we're being forced to do them, and we're in agreement to it, meaning the government is in agreement to get some of these things done. My point is, previous governments, current governments, they were aware of some of these things before. Why haven't these things been done now, beforehand? Now we're being forced to, and now we're being forced to a point where we kind of, as far as the direction of how we're doing these grants and this assistance, we kind of have to come behind the UK and saying they're telling us how they want us to do it, and we have to kind of say, okay, well, yes or no. And I think we're kind of like rocking a hard place because it's, I think, to the point where
Do you think they're gonna dictate the process, or are we gonna have flexibility to create the process that suits us?
I think what happens is the hard place is because where we are right now, I think we're to the point place, if we don't implement some of these things the way that they want this to be done, they have the right to suspend the Constitution, kind of a thing. So I think that balance where you have that hanging over your head, you're trying
Yeah.
to prevent that. So are we acting in the best interest of everybody, or we're acting in the best interest to avoid the suspension of the Constitution? That's kind of a
But to me, the suspension of the Constitution could have happened at any time before this, because, correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, because of our constitutional order and how our relationship is with the administrating power, they didn't need an excuse to do it. I mean, it sounds like that's what's going to happen now in terms of it's hanging over our heads, but this thing was always there from even before.
Yes and no. Where I would disagree is that I suppose not because you have the power to do something means you have the right to do it. You have, for
Mhm.
example, someone has the power to kill someone, but they don't have the right to do it, do they?
Uh-huh.
So in the same vein, yes, you have the power to change it under the laws, under your laws, but under international law, you do not have the right to take away my democratic rights, especially because you signed onto the treaty, extended it to us, and now you are saying you're going to violate international law, take away my rights to vote, or not mine. When I say mine, I mean I'm just talking generally about belongers. Take away the belongers' rights to vote.
Uh-huh.
That doesn't seem like they have the right to me, and I think
So
that
you're saying then by international law that shouldn't have even been a recommendation.
no, I don't see how it could possibly be even a reasonable recommendation for any public officer to make. So what essentially the public officer, as he was at the
Mhm.
time, so Gary Hickenbottom, he's
Okay.
making a recommendation to suspend the supreme law of the land. Does that seem like a reasonable thing to you?
Well, it's
No,
temporary,
honestly.
temporary and partial. I know that's where they made sure they were very careful with their selection of words. Eh?
Well, not quite, because if we actually take a look um, at paragraph 3.25, or is it 3.26 of the COI report, it says on the basis of the evidence, assistance grants are distributed by members of the House of Assembly in a legally arbitrary and unlawful manner. Now, just listen to that phrase. In a legally arbitrary and unlawful manner. Now, that sounds like an irony, doesn't it? How can something be unlawful and legal at the same time? What he really means to say is that the assistance grants are not being carried out in accordance with the principles of natural justice, right? But he could have said that, but he's but it would appear that he tried to paint a picture that we are somehow acting unlawfully when we are acting perfectly lawfully. Now, I think it's very important, though, with respect to everything, to recognize that yes, the assistance grant needs improving. Whether it's the procedures, the paperwork that is required, all of that needs improving. But prior to hearing what Cromwell had to say just a few minutes ago, Mr. Edu Enka, sorry, I apologize. What Edu Enka had to say a few minutes ago, I was actually of the opinion, yes, perhaps we shouldn't have the assistance grants. But then he made a very valid point about, well, what if someone has an emergency and this is their only place to turn to? What then? And then Mr. Gary Reimer, made a very wonderful point as well, that a great point actually, that we are a society where we have regular access to our politicians and our elected representatives, and by taking away the assistance grants, you're in a way taking away the ability of a resident, not even a citizen of the Virgin Islands, a resident of the Virgin Islands, to interact with the elected representative in a meaningful way. And I think those are some very powerful points. And when you take away someone's ability to interact with their elected representatives in a meaningful way, you're creating disenfranchisement with the system even more.
Yeah. But then could we not say still that as your representative, there's still that first point of contact with the public service? Because let's say, for example, if I do want to know how to get assistance, I don't think persons are just going to go off to social development department as a forced response. They might still go to their representatives, or should go to their representatives, to get guidance on what the process is, how things need to be done, because there are still going to be those that need assistance with the assistance process. We know how public service bureaucracy tends to get at times, and that the relationship will change, but I don't think it will disappear completely. I don't know if that's what Gary, was that what you were referring to, or is it that the relationship definitely will shift?
Yeah, not disappear completely, just it will shift. I think also too, so because I think so the elected officials have a certain purse amount that they are granted for that particular situation. So they're the ones who decide based on their need, based on their constituents that they know the need. So the power of that then goes away to the social development department, because then they would have to develop criteria for each person, whether or not they were regularly getting that particular grant under their representative for whatever reason. They may develop stricter criteria where that person no longer now qualifies, because now you have to have a system where everybody's it fits everybody across the board. I don't think District 1 can have a system where it's different from District 2. The social development is going to have a system that is for everyone. It fits across the board, and that in itself may create again that system where the relationship from the constituent to the representative now, as far as the aid itself, is a little separate. Not that it's going to be completely severed, but I think you're forcing them now to go to a government agency as opposed to directly to their representative for assistance. And then also to go ahead.
Is that a bad thing though?
Well, I guess it depends it depends if we're saying if we think the process is corrupt or not. That's the issue now. So it depends. If we feel that there is corruption in that particular system, then you do need to create guidelines. But even if it is not, the issue, I think, as everybody's talked about before, is transparency. It's always been transparency and across the board. People whisper these different things here and there, whether or not they have facts or not, because of the lack of transparency. Creating transparency, I think it kind of dumbs down the noise that people feel as far as corruption. And I think that's one of the reasons for the whole COI. They haven't specifically talked about corruption. Their thoughts are there may or may not be corruption based on this or that. And I guess that's how everything turns out, or where everything's based upon. Now, the investigations now
Have to
will
expose that in
right,
terms of presenting evidence.
correct.
Yeah. All right, Edwinka?
One of the things, if I may, Shaina, uh, that to me is important to note. The As a founding member of the National Democratic Party, we grappled with that issue because a lot of the members, the politicians, would prefer to have the grants administered under social development because, as I said, they weren't able to carry home the salary from the election, from being a politician. They were spending the grant money and their own money to the point where their businesses were supporting them, and they were been happy to have changed the system. I don't know what prevented them from changing it, but the process in social development to administer the grants, to administer the emergency aid, needs to be strengthened, made transparent, and flexible in order to meet the needs of the community, the immediate needs of the community. You have to wait the process is too cumbersome, and you got to wait too long to get the emergency aid. You can't wait a month till when the board in the committee in the social development meets to give you $500 to pay your rent while you're being evicted. So it needs to be flexible and transparent, so that there is no quote unquote malfeasance or maladministration in the process. But not that. But I don't see that there's corruption in that area. So I think that those are
But
some
remember, the question isn't just about corruption, abuse of office, and serious dishonesty.
Well, perhaps the solution.
I don't
Perhaps
see
the
it.
solution is simply that we need to have a process by which persons are able to access funds on an emergency basis, and confidentially, but also but maybe it can be done with a committee within the House of Assembly, or some process.
Yeah.
With these, maybe increasing the response time of social development to certain things, have an emergency committee within social development so that they are able to respond to these things.
Yeah.
It
would
time,
be
rather than island time.
Yeah, and I guess too that's how part and parcel in terms of, in my mind, because as an engineer, my thought process is, okay, so we're saying that the system has been audited. We've identified the issues in terms of a good governance standpoint, right? What would be best practice that should happen? And one of the thoughts that came to me, and I'd like to throw out to you guys to give me your feedback on before we start to wrap up, is what about a portion of that money being put up for availability to nonprofit organizations who are also supposed to be assisting our community, to allow them to apply, let's say, for $1 million grant. So we have institutions like FSN, Family Support Network, Red Cross, WIN BVI. I know at one point that FSN, for example, used to receive some kind of grant money from the government, and then it was stopped. I don't know if it was ever resumed. But what are your thoughts about that? Because again, we want to make sure that there's an effective and efficient system that's put in place. But it doesn't all have to be built into the public service. It can actually be where we look at what other institutions or their social institutions that exist to provide assistance to the community to be able to do that. And then in the cases back to the districts, that we still have an allocation for district projects and things like the district office, because you do need, I think, at a district level, some type of allocation that allows each district rep as well as the territorial to be able to deal with stuff like that. What do you guys think about that idea?
Okay, so I think I just want to put this out before the others, my other panelists, respond. One of the concerns that the commissioner raised with respect to the assistance grants is that they were not actually following what we know as natural justice, meaning someone that applies to the grant doesn't know the criteria for which they may be eligible for the grant. They do not receive the reasons if they are rejected, why they are rejected, and there's no appeals process by which they can go to someone else, go to a higher body for a different decision. Now, whether or not, if you have time to appeal, in my opinion, you have time to go to social development. That's one point. The other point is that the other concern that I saw, if you just grant me 1 second to bring it up, which was of particular import, was that earlier I just spoke a minute ago about there being how do I say it again? Oh yes, about there being specific criteria. We need to develop guidelines, which were suggested by Wendell Gaskin back in 2009, and then according to the report, and I actually have seen his report as well. This was supposed to have been developed between 2009 and 2011, but nothing ever happened. And so we do need to work on, firstly, guidelines, I believe, and criteria. That is the first step in reforming assistance grants. But I'll leave it to the other members to say what they have to say on the matter.
Okay. All right. So Gary, what do you think? Carmel, we should give grants to the MPOs?
I think so. I think there needs to be a balance on that. I mean, in the U.S., for example, the Red Cross, for example, if somebody's house burns down and somebody's homeless right away, one of the first agencies on site giving out free hotel stays right away for somebody to be is the Red Cross. So those agencies, and then the person, then if they then go to the government agency, because I think a lot of the times the other agencies other than government are faster to act because they don't have to go through a red tape, or they can kind of act based on the way that they're set up. So I think the balance there, those organizations can help in an emergency situation where something is needed right away. They can help that balance. So I think I agree with everybody where I think we do have to have some kind of criteria in place where emergency is part of the process. One of the things as well too with this whole COI that we mentioned too is, in addition to implementation of these this grant system, a call has been made for a investigation for the last 3 years for all of the programs, all of the money, and all the grants. So with the amount of investigations and the amount of going backwards, and at the same time managing new systems, do we have enough resources to manage all that, to be able to implement new systems that are in place, but also provide sufficient, well orchestrated audits that they're looking at the same time? Because a lot of times, based on the COI, they're wanting these audits to happen forthwith, right away. But at the same time, too, they want the implementation of these systems forthwith as well, too. So my thing right now is making sure the resources are there for people, because I'm more concerned for the individual person, because their need is not going to change. They're still going to have a need. So my concern is that we don't create a system now where we're implementing a new system where it creates bottleneck for the average citizen who really needs help.
That's how you know the temporary suspension of the Constitution for 2 years was a trick, because none of that could happen. All of the implementation and the audits could not happen in a space of 2 years. It's just not possible. Humanly possible at all. These things take time.
Yeah.
And that's,
I think the reform of the system is going to take at least 5 years.
And I guess that's why too there was a little fine print in there that says, or can be extended at will.
Yeah.
The little fine print was there, and that could be what, 2, as you said, 2, 5 years, 10 years, however they feel they need to extend it if they do it. So.
Exactly. So there's uncertainty in there, and we all know what an uncertainty is like. Well, once you get used to a particular system, it is very hard to change from it, isn't it? So if you get used to a dictatorship, you just say, well, that's life.
Well, that's a whole other show in itself. But we got to start a wrap up. So Cromwell, your thoughts. What else would you recommend?
I'm in agreement. I'm in favor of giving grants to NGOs, providing they have the administrative infrastructure to distribute the grants in a transparent and accountable way. I'm not in favor of that. That would take some of the burden off of the civil service to help with the safety nets that's needed in the community. So I'm in favor in that. But but my general point with the COI recommendations is that we need to assess and analyze the recommendations to see what the impact, the social, economic, and political impacts of those recommendations will be to our community, and to make sure that the implementation of the recommendation is not going to be harmful to us culturally, politically, socially, and economically. And then Daniel just mentioned a good point as well. Who gonna pay for all of this implementation? It's gonna cost a lot of money over a lot of time to do all of these things that is being recommended. These 45 recommendations. So there has to be a reasonable timetable for implementation. There has to be. I'm suggesting an analysis of the recommendations to make sure that we should in fact implement them, and how they should be implemented, and the cost of implementation has to be determined. Yeah. And in addition to that, given the global situation as it stands now, there are a series of moves that the country needs to make, or representatives need to make, in order to secure our survival in the global situation, in the global context. Yeah. Food supply is a major issue. Energy production is another major issue. Health care and wellness maintenance is another major issue. And I even put in education and infrastructure further down on the list. Yeah. You understand what I'm saying? And I'm not hearing, all I'm hearing about is this commission of inquiry recommendation. And then the UK government has this constitution suspension hanging over our head. So we are operating in fear of the constitution being suspended, and so it's almost like we have a puppet government, where if we don't do exactly what the UK say, they could suspend our constitution at any time. You know, and that's an untenable and unacceptable situation for the UK to put our country in. I'll say it 100 times, that you can't go to the criminal for redress. You cannot go to the person who committing the crime against you. You can't go to them and say, listen, stop beating them up over the head. Why they continue to beat you over your head? You have to go to another source of redress. And to me, that source of redress is the United Nations. Because
that's an important point that we get to in another show. Time ran out on us, so I will let you close out there and then go to Gary and Daniel. We seem to have lost Bishop, so we're gonna wrap up here and come back for part 2 another time. So the point of redress, I guess that's where you were ending on there, Cromwell.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm saying as a government, we have other things we have to do. The UK should have helped us with these situations decades ago. It is their fault is their failing, their administrative failings why we're in this situation. Because a lot of things that we were doing, we wasn't thinking about them that they were corrupt. We were thinking of them as helping our constituents and helping our people. That's what we were thinking about them. And I reject the notion of the COI that there's all this widespread corruption in the British Virgin Islands. The British Virgin Islands are made up of decent people, and the civil service is made up of a bunch of decent people. And I don't care what Hickenbackham said. Ain't got no widespread corruption in the Virgin Islands. Yes, we made some administrative mistakes here and there. We didn't follow procedures here and there, and we could have done things differently, and we need to do things in a little more transparent way. But I reject that whole COI notion of all this corruption in the territory. They paint us all of us with this broad brush, and we need to prepare ourselves to address this issue outside of the UK, so that they don't continue to hold this threat of constitutional suspension over our head, because we have a lot of other things that we need to do for our survival right now.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it right there.
That's important. Yep. You pause right there. All right. Gary?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we went to cover today, a lot of topics, and I think I'll repeat this again. I think one of the issues that we're facing right now is that we're having to act reactively instead of proactively. I keep making that point, and we end up in this situation. I think always when you act reactively, it costs you more, and right now it's costing the BVI more. We're not talking about just in money. We're talking about just the way we have to operate as a government, as a society, people's pains. It's just all these recommendations are affecting everyone in the BVI. Nobody's immune from it. It's not just government officials. It's the whole citizenship of the BVI. My point for some of this stuff is that we could have helped some of this stuff before. The last time I came here, I said we could have stopped some of this stuff before by implementing on our own some of the framework and transparency that we had. Everybody talked about things that's already in place, that we have in place that are pre-written. We don't have to rewrite a lot of this stuff, but for whatever reason, we failed to implement a lot of these things. And now we're now being forced to do it.
And I think you raised a very good point there that we'll pick up in the next show, that, when we talk about getting to the root of the problem, that's where it has to start. Because even now that you have another set of recommendations, because like you rightfully said, we've had internal audit reports that have pointed out, issues and concerns before, but they weren't addressed. And if we don't solve that problem first, then we're going to continue to repeat the same things a few years later on. So thanks again for dropping by tonight. And we look forward to you coming back. Daniel, leave us with your thoughts.
Well, firstly, my first thought is thank you for inviting me onto your show, and it was a pleasure meeting Gary Reimer for the first time and being on the same show as Eduenka. It's been a wonderful experience, and so thank you. Secondly, I think I would wholeheartedly agree with Mr. Reimer that I think that there were issues. We saw issues going on before, and so there are things that we ought to have implemented from beforehand. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in a situation because part of our issue is that we like to wait and see too much rather than acting proactively. And I know this is something that Eduenka has echoed on many of occasions, as well as you. That these are things that is something that we're going to have to change. But I also agree with Eduenka that we have to look towards our survival at this moment, especially in terms of what's happening globally, and what's happening, how can we improve cooperation between here and the USVI so that we have a stabler and stronger economy together, how we can improve tourism numbers and everything like that. We have to focus on our economy as well. And last point is that Mr. Reimer and Eduenka earlier spoke about the resources that it's going to take to do all these audits and implementation. But just to give you the scale of it, it's I want to leave your viewers with one question: for how many years have the how many statutory boards have been audited in the past few years, and how long, therefore, will the audits take if they haven't been audited? I'm not saying that they haven't been audited, but if they have not been audited, and how many of them have not been audited, that is going to take some serious looking at, because a lot of the issues that we face in society today in the BVI culture isn't due down to central government, it's down to the running of statutory bodies. And so we're going to have to discuss in the future how we go about appointing members to the statutory bodies, whether or not they should be elected as they are in the US, or should we continue with this appointment system. But those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, guys, I think we broke off a chunk of this. It's 10 chapters, just to let everybody know. There's 10 chapters of recommendations. So this is the first one. But we kind of touched on several of them. So we're gonna take our time, go through it. Just in case persons, may have missed the beginning of the show, go back, take a look at it, and we're gonna continue to roll these out over the next few weeks and months, to make sure that we understand exactly what we are up against. Because again, as we heard our Premier say, I think in this week's statement, they are still waiting on a response from the UK government as it relates to the proposal that was put forward in terms of implementation of these recommendations. What I am looking forward to, though, is that he said that town halls are supposed to start later on this month, where we can ask those questions in terms of what was put forward in implementation and our concerns before anything is actually implemented, because getting the public perspective on things is going to be very important, I think, to make sure that we do the right things, as we've all been saying tonight, that it may be late, but better late than never. And we want to make sure that we're improving our country now for the future, and wherever that may take us. We want to make sure that we are laying the foundation now. So on behalf of all of my co-hosts from other shows tonight, we want to just encourage everybody, keep hopeful. The quote I had from last time, actually, I think it applies this time still. The need for growth, for development, for change is fundamental to life. And that's something that's always going to be change. And it's something where we can either see the glass as half full or half empty. But, let's keep moving forward and do what is necessary, not just for us, because I think that's one of the biggest things that we have to also remind ourselves. This is for our children's children, because they're the ones that are going to be the beneficiaries, or the ones that are going to have to pay the bill if we don't get this right? So like our Facebook page, if you haven't, the Vigilante Dialogue, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Every time we're going live, it's going to pop up a reminder for you. Until next time, I am Shaina Smith-Archer saying, let's continue the change in conversation for a better Virgin Islands.